Hey YouTube, this is Wexdarn here, and I'm here to talk to you today about the official Zelda timeline and just give a few reasons on why I disagree with it. Now, some of you watching this might remember my older videos on the subject, but I decided to remake them simply because I'm just going to try and streamline them down, and I know in the last videos I tended to ramble a fair bit. So I've just got a set of reasons here for why I disagree with the timeline, and I'm just going to go through them one by one. And yes, before we get into this, I'm fully aware that this timeline from Nintendo is official and therefore Nintendo must be right and all that jazz, but I personally still think that the timeline should be open to discussion and to each person's individual interpretations of the timeline. Remember that Nintendo's actually built these games going gameplay first and story second, so a majority of what they're putting into the timeline is actually down to their interpretations of the events that happened in game. Since one interpretation is never technically fully accurate, then everybody else's interpretation is just as valid as anyone's. Now, the first reason that I disagree with Nintendo's timeline for the Zelda series is that there's clearly meant to be a connection between Ocarina of Time, A Link to the Past, and Twilight Princess. Like, the Temple of Time from Ocarina is supposed to be the same pedestal of time from A Link to the Past and the same temple as the one from Twilight Princess. When you see in Twilight Princess that when Link steps through the door of time, the temple returns to the same state that it was in Ocarina, even with having the same background music. The temple in Twilight Princess is also set in the middle of some woods, as opposed to being in the castle town area like in Ocarina. These woods are supposed to be the Lost Woods from A Link to the Past, and to further enforce this link, the game was originally going to play the music from A Link to the Past Lost Woods, rather than playing Saria's song, which was Ocarina of Time's Lost Woods. And in fact, the remix for A Link to the Past Lost Woods music that was going to be used in Twilight Princess is the music that's being played in the background of this video at this point in time. Another thing that I have a problem with about the Zelda timeline is when A Link to the Past was ported over to the Game Boy Advance, they changed and updated a couple of things, like having the intro refer to 7 sages instead of 7 wise men, removing a secret room and a couple of other things. But one thing that they could have easily updated and decided not to for some reason is the appearance of the sages and the maidens. If the sages spoken of in A Link to the Past intro are supposed to be the same ones as the Ocarina of Time sages, then why do they bear so much more resemblance to the Twilight Princess ancient sages? This could have easily changed by just creating a couple of new sprites to insert, and the same thing could have been said for the 7 maidens, where they all 7 of them look like Hylians, and they could have just been swapped out to match each race. Like, we could have had a Kokori sprite, a Goron one, a Zora one, a Sheikah one, a Garuda one, and yes, a Hylian one, because there still was one of the 7 sages being Hylian. And it wouldn't have been that hard for Nintendo to update this, because they did spend some time on the port, and they did edit part of the game's content, like I said earlier. And they even added a second game, 4 Swords, to this port. So really, if they wanted these sages to match the sages from Ocarina of Time, they could have updated it there and then. Now, a third problem I had with Nintendo's official Zelda timeline is the actual Legend of Zelda. Now, The Legend of Zelda is supposed to be the main reason why all the princesses in Zelda are called Zelda. And it's a incident that occurred before Zelda 2, where one of the princesses ended up being cursed and fell into a deep sleep until somebody could wield all three pieces of the Triforce. This is an important part of the Zelda mythos and explains why all the princesses have that name. But why would it be placed so close to the end of the timeline with only 2 games taking place afterwards, and at a time in the timeline where Hyrule has apparently stopped being such a great kingdom compared to what it was? If this legend was to take place on this timeline, surely it would take place higher up in Hyrule's history than towards the end of it. Another reason why I don't believe in Nintendo's timeline is that Ganon suddenly gets revived for the first game, strangely. In the games where Ganon's been killed just to return, there's always been an explanation for the return, whether it's been the main aim of his underlings all along, like the Oracle games, or it's just a throwaway line like in Four Swords Adventures. According to the Hyrule Historia that was released by Nintendo to explain the timeline, Ganon was brought back from the dead for his appearance in the original Zelda game. But there's no explanation or even hint at this in the first game, and from what I can tell, there isn't one in the Historia either. He just comes back and there isn't really any explanation whatsoever. And since there's always been some information explaining why Ganon's back, why wouldn't there be one here? It just feels like something that they've just made up to try and patch the gap quickly. My final reason for not believing in Nintendo's official timeline is that the timeline has clearly been changed and rewritten over the years, and why wouldn't it happen again and we'd just be dealing with a false timeline this time around? You see, at the launch of Wind Waker, an interview with Eiji Aonuma and Shigeru Miyamoto, and later a post on the official Zelda homepage, and I'm paraphrasing here rather than direct quoting, but they stated that there was only 2 timelines at the release of Wind Waker. One where Link was a child, and the other one where Link defeated Ganondorf as an adult. But since Wind Waker is one of the first games in the splits, and Majora's Mask and A Link to the Past being the other 2 games at the top of the 3 splits being already released, wouldn't Nintendo have already established 3 splits at this point? So clearly they've been rewriting this as they go along, and what's the point in believing them now if they're just going to end up changing the timeline again down the line? Anyway, that's been my more streamlined video on why I disagree with Nintendo's Zelda timeline. Please leave comments saying what you think, and if you think I'm right about anything, if you think I'm wrong about anything, then let's just discuss it and see what theories we come up with here. Hopefully I should have a second video out soon which will just be a streamlined version of my personal timeline. And I guess see you later, YouTube.